Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Brad Su and I'm the product marketing manager at Commerce Tools. I have now seen a couple of people joining, so let's just wait for about 2 minutes to make sure everyone's in and then we'll start the webinar. Again, let's wait for another minute or so just so everyone can join in. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Brad Su, and again, I'm the product marketing manager at Commerce Tools. Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar. In today's session, Ivo Bronsveld, our head of integrations, will be talking about JAMStack, and he will take you through various points about JAMStack, such as how you can make use of this newly coined term, what it really means, how this term came about, why you should be using JavaScript APIs and Markup, the benefits of JAMStack, best practices, and more. There will be a Q&A session towards the end of this webinar, so feel free to raise your questions in the chat box on the right side at any time. You can do this by just typing in your questions and then we'll answer them towards the end of the webinar. We'll also be recording this webinar so that you can review it at a later time. And with that, I will be handing things over to our speaker, Ivo.
Thank you, Brad. Thanks for the wonderful introduction. And first of all, great to be here to talk about JAMStack and all the wonders of that. And I'm happy to be able to take you by the hand and at least give you an introduction into JAMStack and why we think this is an important technology to keep in mind. But before doing that, I want to talk a bit about me, just to give you a bit of an idea who I am and what I've been doing and what I do at Commerce Tools. So like Brett mentioned, I'm head of integrations at Commerce Tools, which means that I'm responsible for all things to do with technology partnerships and integrations, like in the title, right? So I do everything around that. I'm working a lot with our technology partners. And one of the things that we recently did is launching our integration marketplace. So that's what I do here. My background is actually, you can see I've had a bit of a weird loop. I started as a developer, went into project management, and quickly realized that that is certainly not my strength. And I went into sales, then into product and innovation. So I kind of started in the consultancy business, ended up at Hippo CMS, which got acquired by Bloomreach, and then ended up at Commerce Tools in the end. Fun fact is that I actually was one of the first people that started the partnership with Commerce Tools at Hippo at that time. So I know the guys from Commerce Tools actually for quite a while already, and it's actually very nice to be here now. But one big thing that I would say that has always been a focus for me in all that I've been doing is that it's always been really about the customer experience and front end. So I think that's why I'm also very excited to be able to talk here a bit about JAMStack, because it's such a wonderful new front end technology. All right, so just some context before we actually dive into the specifics. I think it's always good to point this out. Like JAMStack is really early in the so-called hype cycle. Like with any innovation, whether that's machine learning or big data or all that kind of stuff, usually it's obviously all great expectations you get on that. It's like it's going to change the world. It's going to be amazing, and it's going to solve all our problems. Then we, well, kind of reality check that and realize that it might not always be the best, but in the end, hopefully, if this technology is great, you'll see it end up in the plateau of productivity, aka it's a well-established technology. JAMStack is not there yet. So if you're looking to start a new project and thinking, hey, is this something for us? Then by all means, keep it in mind. It might very well be, but also keep in mind that it's still relatively new. So it might have some things that it still needs to mature a bit. Now, that being said, the origins, as you can see, this is a quote from the co-founder of Netlify. So he's one of the people that actually coined the term JAMStack. And he is one of the people that started this, like I said, and relatively new, right? As you can see in 2016. But what is interesting is that this is one of those technologies, or one of those sorts of technologies that is founded by a company similar to the mock principles that we at Commerce Tools talk about a lot. It's really to show the benefits of the platform. So yes, on the one hand, there's a commercial side of it for Netlify, obviously, because it helps explain what their platform does. But I also think it's a principle that really applies broader than just specifically for Netlify. Now, what he said, right? It's a combination of JavaScript, APIs, and markup. So the JavaScript client side runs in the browser, does basically all the dynamic things. The APIs providing functionality and data to the JavaScript for the dynamic parts of the actual markup. So all of these three things is basically part of the recipe of what you need to be focused on in a JAMStack, well, let's say implementation. And all of these things have their own little role to play. So let's start with markup. Obviously, HTML markup, right? It's either built by hand or using a static site generator, because it's important to realize that in a JAMStack setup, the markup is completely static, as in you generate everything once and you deploy it often to many different locations, right? So it's not a server-side page generation or anything. You build the site in advance, and that's why one of the benefits is so fast, right? So the output of the static site generator would be all of these different HTML files and JavaScript files, and CSS and whatever. You deploy that typically through Git, right? That's the thing, and that's where one of these integrations with Netlify, for example, is so strong, because they have all these tools already in there, so you can use your normal build tools to push things through Git. And then these pre-rendered files are placed on the in the edge, right, on the CDN, and served to the end user. So the benefit is you generate this site once. You can do that daily, for example. You can do that hourly if you want, but typically you generate it in advance, deploy it, and then it's served to the customer. Now, the APIs that are behind this is obviously where all the dynamic stuff comes from, right? These are the APIs that you would think about that you could also find in our integration marketplace, like a content management system like Content Stack or Contentful. It might be a digital asset management system, or it might be a commerce tools, right, that provides data to the front end. So the front end calls to the APIs to get the data that is not part of the static pre-rendering. These it can obviously also be GraphQL, like it mentioned there. GraphQL is obviously something that we really push for, but it is in the end a form of API, either backed by microservices like a Commerce Tools platform or just a third party, but it is providing these dynamic functionalities or data to the front end. Now, one thing here is obviously keep in mind that you want to minimize the number of calls that you're doing, because otherwise it kind of defies the point that you're doing a lot of requests and slowing it down in the end anyways, right? So it's only for specific things that you would need. And an example of that is in this slide here. Like the JavaScript that you can be using in the page is basically, it can be any framework. So you have React, Angular, that's the framework I actually spent a lot of time in, but clearly I don't think it's the most popular anymore. Vue.js, I think, is looking at our customers and also the integrations that we have, probably more of the most important ones at this point in time. Then again, it's front-end technology, so that kind of changes quite rapidly. But any front-end framework that you're using, you can use in a JAMStack thing. So that's an important benefit of that. And what it does is it's actually, because it runs on the client, obviously, it renders just parts of the page. So in this case, if you want to show the product availability or the price, right, that's the only thing that you have to connect to Commerce Tools for example. So only when that data is actually needed, you connect and then you fetch that information, and you can use that obviously to execute functionality as well. So adding things to the cart, for example, would be one of those things that you would do using JavaScript. It's obviously impossible to do that in static HTML, but all the other things, such as like the product name or the actual the images and things like that, that is something that doesn't change as often as you as the price or availability might change. So those things are all part of that statically generated markup that you deploy on the cloud. So that's the next part, right? That's the one final part of that I don't think, well, that's probably the stack in JAMStack. You need to deploy it somewhere, right? And that's where Netlify or Fastly or an Akamai or a standalone CDN comes in, where you deploy it in the edge there. Or you could use AWS, GCP, like the standard services there. You can use GitHub pages. Basically, you can use anything that you want to host it, as long as it serves static HTML and JavaScript and CSS, you're good to go. That's another benefit, I would say, that you don't have to set up all these expensive servers, right? You can use standard technology for that. Now, roughly speaking, so what it comes down to is that you need three things, or at least you throw a bunch of things into a static site generator, such as like a Gatsby of sorts, those kind of things. The JavaScript framework that we talked about, the product catalog content, for example, and other content coming from a CMS, like the content stack or Contentful. All of those things combined will help you generate that pre-rendered website, which you then host. And the customer, the end user, will connect to that hosting and that hosted site directly. And that's where that vision, like their markup, would come from, right? It's served through that. Now, what is it not? I think that is almost just as important as defining what it is. First of all, JAMStack is not a specific product or architecture, right? There's no company that will release JAMStack as a standalone thing. It might support it, but it's not a product on its own. It's more of a, think of it like a design principle or a design pattern of sorts. It's not synchronously generating HTML documents. So in other words, it's not JAMStack if you generate the pages for every request, right? AKA if you're using a web server or server-side pages, or like in my day when I was still doing CMS, like using a Tomcat and then Java to generate server-side pages and stuff, that's not part of JAMStack. That's something completely different, right? So the idea is definitely that you would have to generate these pages in advance and just use JavaScript for the tiny parts of the page that are actually dynamic. So one might say, doesn't that mean that JAMStack is actually headless? Well, I would say probably that JAMStack is a sort of form of headless, maybe, but the more traditional headless in PWAs and things like that is that you generate these pages typically still dynamically, right? In a normal, with a Vue.js or a React or something, you would render these pages dynamically still and then connect to the backend. So that part is actually pretty much still the same, but it happens mostly synchronously, so during the building of the pages. While on the JAMStack side, you have your static pre-rendered pages on the deployed, right? Those pieces of HTML, and in there you connect to backends, which is similar to the headless setup, right? So you would still connect to Commerce Tools or to the CMS or to any other service, but you can also do that asynchronously at different moments. So maybe to personalize the recommendations on the bottom of the page, right? That's a different call, and you don't have to wait for that to generate the page because the page is already generated. So you do those calls asynchronously. Now, what are the benefits there? I think it's already quite clear, but just to highlight it, it's definitely performance, right? Like with Akamai, you see the coverage that they have with their network, so all of the different locations that they can be able to deploy your site to. So even if you're in Europe or mainland US or something, you could still easily deploy your sites to Akamai, for example, in Hawaii, right? You can do that easily. And that's why you're there on premise, or at least in that location, right? In that specific, and you don't have to set up any hardware yourself there. Now, another benefit of that, and I think that's maybe more interesting as well, is like the cost, because it's ridiculously cheap to just serve static HTML because you don't have to do any processing, right? It's just a bit of data transfer, but there's no real server crunching time or anything like CPU time that you're using on the cloud or anywhere else. So that makes it also a very affordable option to run your site and especially to deploy it locally. So that combination of having like locally deployed high performing websites that also are relatively cheap make JAMStack, I think, a great option. The third option in there, and that's, I think, especially important with Black Fridays and things like that coming up, but also in this example with Cristiano Ronaldo having about 220 million followers, as soon as he posts something on social, you know, there's going to be a lot of traffic coming from that, and that traffic might be definitely impacting the performance of your site, like especially if you're not expecting it or you're not prepared for that. Now, I doubt that he does all of this on his own, right? There sure is a entire campaign and a team and everything behind that, but still, it's important to note that whatever the traffic is going to be, that you're able to handle that. And by using JAMStack setup, you would automatically get a lot more performance purely because of the fact that you're not spending any CPU cycles or anything, just getting data from, for example, Commerce Tools, right? The product information is already in the page. It's baked in the HTML. So you don't have to fetch that information if it hasn't changed. So in that case, you're making it way more performant and way more scalable, even for the high intense and usage situations. So some examples, just to see, like we've actually used this ourselves. So we are a JAMStack implementer, if you will. So we actually yesterday launched this completely new website. So I had to quickly take a new version of this screenshot, and kudos to our documentation team for rolling that out. But I think this is such a great example of when you should be thinking about using JAMStack, right? It's a static site, or mostly static, but at least you can build a lot of these things, you know, using these site generators. We use Gatsby ourselves as well, and then you can deploy that easily to the different clouds and the different environments. So this is one example. Another one is actually Daniel Wellington. I've been involved with them from the very first time that I actually joined Commerce Tools. So I've been actually in their office and talking to them, and they actually explained to me that they were doing this and they were using this JAMStack thing, which at first was a bit odd to me, especially coming from a CMS background where we're so used to pushing, you know, personalized server-side pages and all that kind of stuff. And they were like, no, we're really going to just generate the site every once in a while and then just deploy it to the local instances. And I was very, to me, in a way, and it kind of shows my age, but maybe it shows a bit like that you're going back in time, right? But I also think this is one of those great examples of that we're going back to technology that is, or at least this new technology enables like a better way of doing things, right? So it's this example of generating all of these different sites, localized and all, and just deploying them, and don't have to set up these traditional sort of servers to handle all of this traffic. So that makes it a lot better. Another example, more locally, the Gene Center, they've chosen to do this as well. And it's also one of those examples, I think, that they were able to quickly roll out. And even in situations when you're not expecting necessarily a lot of traffic, because obviously the Dutch market is probably a bit smaller than universally or globally, but at least it's a great example of how you can do this. Now, finally, how to get started, right? A lot of people want to get started maybe with this JAMStack thing or with Commerce Tools specifically. So here's on our site, you can immediately create a trial. That's just a good thing to point out. So if you haven't played around with our APIs yet and would like to see how you could get this to work in a environment, for example, go directly to our site and start your trial there directly. And there's also this link, and I'm sure that Brad will share this as well with you guys, but I think this is a great ebook that you can have a look at for the to get a bit more information, even more in-depth information. And obviously I could provide in this specific webinar, but that's a good source of information as well, directly from the source in this case. Final pointer to the people that are definitely interested and want to learn more about JAMStack and their current state of affairs there. There is an event in October that you guys could go to, and especially now it's probably easier to go to because you don't have to travel. It's obviously all online, so this could be a suggestion as well. I think we're sponsoring this as well, so definitely a shout out to them for that. And that's basically the story. So I would love to see if there's any questions that I can answer or things that I can talk to. So over to you, Brad.
Thanks a lot, Ivo. Really enjoyed that talk and hope you guys did as well. So we're on right now to our Q&A session. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box on the lower right-hand side, and I will go through them to kind of get you your answers from Ivo. So kind of to begin with, the first question I'll pose to Ivo is, how can someone make a dynamic website work with JAMStack? Is that recommended at all?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The question is obviously what is a dynamic website, or at least what is the dynamic part that you're talking about here? Because I think there's a different approach for example, showing product recommendations that are personalized, right? That's a piece of dynamic content that you would want to show versus search results, right? Like I think a search results type of page will always be way more of a candidate to keep that in a more of a traditional setup, maybe, right? To do a server-side kind of thing, or to just embed that dynamically, similar to product recommendations. So what I mean is like there's always going to be areas of your site that will need to be dynamic, you know, and that's where you would use your JavaScript. So in most cases, I think you could combine the dynamic content just as much as you would with the static ones, but you're just using the JavaScript to connect to the APIs to get those personalized product recommendations, for example.
It's a very good answer. That actually brings us to the next question, which is somewhat related from another viewer, which is how do you deal with having personalized pages with JAMStack? I guess this kind of highlights that little niche that you just pointed out, that it might work for certain use cases, but not bigger ones like search. I think personalized pages kind of fall in the category of personalized search, but at the same time, you have a lot narrower results to show. So would that work out with JAMStack?
Yeah, I think like obviously you need to use it and think about it really. Like if you don't get the benefits, or if 90% of your pages are dynamic and that means that you can't pre-generate them, then I don't think JAMStack would be the way forward, because it's not necessarily helping you much with the performance side of things, you know, because you still have to do all kinds of calls on the server. So that is also one of the recommendations around APIs. Try to limit those, right? So I think JAMStack is by definition something that would really help with more static views of the content. And most product detail pages, let's be honest, are still very static, right? The product title, the product images, the carousel, like all that kind of stuff is something that you can generate in advance. But then, like I said, a product recommendations, like a carousel underneath the product detail page, that is something that you would definitely be able to add using JAMStack and still get the performance benefit. You can do that asynchronously, right? You don't have to wait for the page to get all that information. With the search page, that's different. So if you have all these pages that are basically always dynamic, because there's a lot of permissions maybe on who can see certain products, or then maybe JAMStack is not the way forward.
Sounds good. So the next question is, from a performance perspective, isn't JAMStack pretty much like what a CMS does if it has its content pre-crawled and then cached in a CDN?
In a way, yes. In a way, yes. It still, I think, depends. Like the difference, the nuance I would say there is more around, like from a performance perspective, you might be right, but then the difference is still how you do your data access, your API access. If you're using the CMS for that, if you're still generating these pages, then I think it's not completely a JAMStack setup, but I would say that it could very much be a similar kind of setup, yes.
Okay, makes sense. The next question that I have is, how does JAMStack work with GraphQL? Is this something that can operate with that at all, or do you have to pick one or the other?
Oh, yes, it could definitely work, but I don't think they wanted to add that to the A, right? Adding a G in there suddenly ruins the beautiful acronym. But yes, the APIs, in that case, it doesn't matter if that's a RESTful API or if that's a GraphQL API. Like in the end, it's more of the concept of an API than it specifically has to be an HTTP API that you're connecting to. Like in the end, any form of API would work now and in the future, right? Even the next generation type of APIs that we'll be able to develop will most likely work in this case as well.
That makes a lot of sense, because JAMStack isn't a specific technology. It's kind of like a mix of 3 different bases in a stack that you can kind of use for your development practices, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like in terms of the next question is in terms of cost benefits, how much lower can server load be? Because you're technically having to generate some pages anyway, and if you're not generating all the pages statically, would that translate into cost savings that are not as high as one would imagine to be?
I mean, in theory, that's probably true. Like, I think these questions are obviously always very hard to answer. You could argue that even in that case, even if that's true, right, you could say, okay, but the performance things, the fact that you can deploy to so many different locations, if you have to create a server for all of these locations, for example, that would definitely not work, or set up your AWS for that specifically, right? I don't know. Like ultimately, I think it will always have a cost benefit because of the fact that you're like just purely by nature, you won't be doing that many calls, and you also performance-wise, you're not calling commerce tools all the time, right? Because if you want to generate your product detail pages, those are already done. So I think the cost is one aspect of it, but I think that cost is also seen in performance, as well as like connecting to our APIs, for example, right? The fact that you're not doing that also has a cost benefit, not necessarily because of money, but mostly of performance as well. So I think these things go hand in hand.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In terms of how JAMStack works with e-commerce, is that different from how it would work with a CMS? Because a CMS has a lot more static content, whereas e-commerce does have personalized pages, personalized search. Is it harder to do for e-commerce?
Well, I mean, it might require a bit more thinking, or it might have a bit more data access than, obviously, if you compare it to our documentation website. Yes, our documentation site doesn't have personalized content at all, right? We can really generate all the pages statically. But I do think, based on at least my experience in all these years in CMS and commerce, I would say that a lot of times, most of the pages are actually very boringly pretty static, or at least contain a lot of static information in there. So in that case, I think it still works. And even for commerce, I would think it would be a great thing to look into. But yeah, be mindful. I think complicated B2B scenarios might be a lot more tricky than, say, a B2C brand messaging kind of site,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Because we had a previous webinar in the past that kind of touched on this topic where certain kinds of retailers and commerce websites would do better with certain technology stacks or compositions better than others, you know. For instance, with like a retail consumer facing website, just like Daniel Wellington that you showed earlier on, JAMStack works great because things are more predictable in the sense that there's fewer products, there's a lot more, you know, straightforward implementations over there. Whereas if you compare that to the data model of a B2B business where you have literally thousands or tens of thousands of products with all sorts of different channels and partners and you know.
Yeah, and dynamic pricing in a way, right? Like a lot of times that will be different as well per customer. Or so yes, in those cases, I would definitely be mindful of the effort that you're doing to make it a fully JAMStack site will probably not really be all that helpful, and maybe just doing the more traditional approach would be better.
Yeah, exactly. With that, I guess we pretty much have all our questions, unless anyone has a last question. If not, we will end this webinar. I thank you for your time. Thanks so much for listening, and we will. Oh wait, we have one more question that just came in. How does JAMStack relate to PWAs? Is that either or can you not have a smooth app-like interface if you show pre-rendered pages?
I think honestly, it would be probably right? It would be a combination of the two. Honestly, I think in some cases, if I would struggle to really say what the difference is between the two, other than the fact that it's most of the pages are pre-rendered, but you can still add a lot of the progressive web app like ideas and concepts into that. So I would say that both of these things would still be possible. So it's not like you have to pick one or the other, but in most cases, I think with the offline stuff and that you would need for a PWA, that's something that you get out of the box in this case, right? So I do think there's certainly some benefits to combining both, or looking into combining both. Yes.
All right, thanks for the answer. Well, if we don't have any other questions, then I'm going to actually wrap up the webinar this time. Thanks so much for your time listening in. Again, if you wanted to check some details, you can feel free to rewatch this webinar as we post the recording in the next day or so. You can also reach out to us via commercetools.com. There's a contact page, there's social media, or even if you have a certain like a contact within Commerce Tools, you can also email them as well. And with that, thank you so much and have a great one.